Mitch Daniels was a senior advisor to Ronald Reagan, the 49th governor of Indiana between 2005 and 2013, the president of Purdue University, and an important political figure on the right for over 40 years. Mitch, you were chief of staff to Richard Lugar between 1977 and 1982. He was a bit of a giant, wasn't he, politically? Tell me, what do you think his greatest legacy was, and what did you learn from him?
He'll probably be best remembered for working with Senator Sam Nunn to bring down the number of nuclear armaments in the once Soviet Union. At least at this distance, appears to be a signal accomplishment, is in a term he would have used. You know, he spoke a little British, Andrew, because of his Rhodes Scholar experience. And I was with him so long, you know, you pick up some of these usages, legions of this and signal of that. He was outside my family, the most important person in my life in many ways. I was with him. I knew him as in a way that most of America never did, as a very talented young executive. They knew him as a legislator, an explainer of complex events and policies, a forger of compromises back when those things actually happened. And so he was all of that, but I knew him as a young, idealistic mayor who turned around our hometown. That's where I got tied up with him and stayed with him at his right hand, I guess you'd say, for 13 years. Every time he had once given me a great advice still as a college student, which was to, you know, go out and establish yourself in the world, something in business, things he had done, and then come to public life if that interests you. And then he spent 13 years talking me out of that very advice, and I'm glad he did.
You sort of took it in a way, didn't you?
He was a great moral force for me, in the sense that, you know, as I said at his memorial service, I never saw him make a dishonest decision. I never heard him speak harshly or vindictively about anybody. I never saw him in what we mortals would call a bad mood. And so some of that, not all of it, unfortunately, but a lot of it rubbed off, I hope. And that was, he deserves all the fond memories that surround him.
Do you think it's a world we have lost, the bipartisanship, the lack of harshness and vindictiveness?
Well, you don't need me to tell you that. I hope it's recoverable, but it's not the way politics in this country, or it appears in several others at the moment.
By the time we get to 1985, you're one of the chief political advisors to Ronald Reagan, who obviously is a world historical figure who, when one thinks of the 20th century, one will automatically, and the great men and women of that century, Ronald Reagan will loom large there. What was it actually like, though, working for him?
First of all, I always considered it a misnomer to speak of a political advisor to him. He didn't need any advice. He operated on what of Churchill's, I'll say, second best biographers once, as I recall, described as a gyroscope, as opposed to you know, sonar, as so many politicians in the way that so many of them operate. But no, it was an enormous privilege. We felt a sense of mission, all of us. A good friend of mine stuck around for the subsequent Bush 41 administration. And when that one ended in defeat, somebody asked him to describe the difference, having worked for both. He said, in the Reagan years, when we got up in the morning, we knew what the assignment was. Limit government, cut taxes, fight Russians. And he said it was just in the air, and it was. And there was a little less sense of that compass direction, I guess, in too many other presidencies. But that was certainly there at the time. Clare Boothe Luce told him, Mr. President, every president gets one sentence in history. Yours will be, he won the Cold War without firing a shot. I've said and written that Reagan was the unusual, at least two-sentence president in the sense he did that he certainly won the Cold War, but he restored America's economy and morale or spirit. Either one of those, I think, would have marked him as a significant figure. In his case, I think he's entitled, as I say, to two sentences.
Yes, actually, that reminds me very much of Margaret Thatcher. I think she gets two sentences, and
Yes.
they're pretty much the same two
Yeah.
sentences in a way. Um, by 1987, you were CEO of the Hudson Institute, and which, of course, is still a very serious and substantial think tank. I sit on a couple of think tank boards. Tell us about the role of think tanks, both then and now, because we obviously both think that they're important, but how are they?
Yes. Hudson deserves I think, recognition of being the original, at least American, think tank. There was a bunch of renegades that broke from the Rand Corporation. And it was an enormously formative experience for me in two ways. One was that it was a small business experience. We were a hand to mouth. We were really a contract research organization. If we didn't conceive and sell and produce and get paid for original research, we didn't exist. And so it also, at that time, it was founded, as you probably know, by a legend named Herman Kahn. He was thought to have been the inspiration for the Peter Sellers character in Dr. Strangelove, but that didn't really suit him. He was a brilliant thinker, about a pioneer of game theory, applied it to nuclear deterrence and so many other topics. I learned there to think in a contrarian way, as they always did. They assumed that if by the time some wisdom was conventional, it was probably wrong. And so they weren't always right, but they foresaw things others didn't. They wrote about the coming oil boom when everybody was standing in gas lines. They predicted in the emerging Japanese superstate when everyone thought that Japan would never get past transistor radios. And so it was very helpful to me to be around some very eccentric, very iconoclastic thinkers who were always looking for the angle that no one else had seen. Now, think tanks today are different. They evolved, and Hudson is one of those. Most today have an ideological personality or profile that's very clearly defined, and they serve a good purpose. It's just that one always has to maybe discount a little for the underlying philosophy. There's always the human tendency to go find data that supports your preconceived notions, and some of them do that. But the best produce occasional surprises. Hudson was a constant source of surprise at the time, and so I very much value that. It was just 3 years, but they were 3 very important ones to me, and I'm glad to see them doing great work now, although in a slightly different way.
We're going to jump forward now to your time as the director of the OMB between January 2001 and June 2003, where, of course, you absolutely ultimately, although you were interested in tax cuts and all of the important things that were happening economically, had to deal also with the financing of a global war on terror. Which, needless to say, like all wars, wound up being fantastically expensive. How did you do that? How did you fund it? And what was it like being at the OMB when you suddenly realized that you had essentially a very long war on your hands?
Yeah, I wish we had done it more successfully. as life changed, of course, completely in terms not just the daily lives of Americans, but the priorities of that administration on that day. But I gave a speech at the National Press Club. I think it was in October. It wasn't that long after the events, maybe November. And I cited historical precedent where in the past, when suddenly the nation had found itself in an armed conflict, the government shifted spending dramatically. FDR did it, Harry Truman did it in a huge way. And I suggest that that's what we ought to be doing at that time so that we could take on this new threat and but do so while protecting the public finances. Congress was hard to persuade of that. We had occasional successes, but overall, I think fewer than I wished. Now, all that said, there's a lot of bad history bandied around about that time. If you go look, in 2007, the federal deficit was 1.1 or 2% of GDP, a tiny fraction of what it has been since, and it's headed in the right direction. So despite all the extra costs, first of the Afghanistan activity, and then, of course, the Middle East, the Iraq conflict, the nation's finances were still in reasonably good shape until some housing mistakes pulled the plug out of the tub. But no, those were momentous days, and I was grateful for the chance to be pretty much in the middle of them.
Did you keep a diary? All historians are very interested when politicians, have their own reminiscences. What did you do?
Andrew, I didn't. I was too busy. I mean, at the time.
I know, that's what they all say.
When I
That's
got to the next
infuriating
job,
thing.
I realized I should have, because too much had happened for me to remember. I will say that I've worked on, at the urging of many, a memoir that covers these times we talked about. But for now, I'm working until I get to 2003, 2004. I'm dealing with my own imperfect memory mainly.
Okay, but of course, in 2005, you become the 49th governor of Indiana, and you are re-elected in that job. You hold it until 2013. As governor, you cut the state workforce by 18%. You cut and capped state property taxes. You spent less than inflation. I mean, you did everything that a good, sound fiscal conservative would do. Looking today, what do you think about the prospects of Doge doing these kind of things, especially with regard to the cutting of the workforce?
I applaud the spirit of what they're doing, and I think it's very valuable as they shine a spotlight on ridiculous, redundant, or simply unnecessary things the federal government is doing. I don't expect them to have the kind of success they've claimed they'll have. It's just not the way things work. They're going to have to persuade Congress to go along. I have supported for a long time tools that might help them, impoundment being the principal one. In fact, I just wrote a Washington Post column on this subject. I don't consider it a radical idea at all. I had this sort of power as governor. That is the power for the executive to decline to spend every penny that has been appropriated. It's not a radical idea. The presidents had it all the way up until the Watergate reforms. Eisenhower used it, Truman used it, FDR used it, Thomas Jefferson used it. And that would help, because then when Doge brings something to light, the executive branch would have the authority not to spend it. They'll try to do some of this, but I would rather they had the explicit power, and I wish Congress, on some basis, conditional, time-limited, some basis, would restore it. But no, I wish them well. One other thing must be said. for all the bravado and all the talk about reining in government and so forth, they refuse to talk about the entitlement programs, which is where all the money is, so to speak, or the vast majority. And as long as you keep those out of bounds, you're really only dealing in a very marginal way with the urgent problem of heading off a real fiscal catastrophe. I use that word advisedly, of the kind that history plainly forecasts for a nation in our situation.
Yeah,
Our friend Neil Ferguson has formulated this so-called Ferguson's Law. Now, I think he attributes it to a
yeah, it's named after
from a couple
Adam
centuries back.
Ferguson, not
Yeah, he
not
wasn't
Neil
trying to name it
Ferguson.
after himself.
No, he wasn't. He wasn't. I
But he's
think that was
making a
just
very
a lucky
important point
coincidence,
for listeners who
frankly.
haven't seen it. He can't find an historical antecedent where a country wound up spending more on debt service than it was spending on its security or national defense that lasted very long. And we just passed that point. It's a very important negative landmark.
It's a brilliant, especially if you actually read the entire article, the long article in the academic journal, you actually realize that he's got five major empires of history, world history, including, I'm embarrassed enough to admit, the British Empire, where when they spend more on debt reduction than they do on defense, things start to collapse, and sometimes collapse very quickly. And this is happening this year in your country. So, but it wouldn't happen if people were following the kind of lines that you had laid down in OMB, and certainly with your stance on balancing budgets and so on.
No, now again, I operated when I got the chance to operate as the decision maker, and in those years here in the state, we had tools, or at least we asserted we did, and used them. And we're able to work with a legislature which was operating under the presumption that we ought to, at least over a certain period of time, make ends meet. And but as you know, the federal government comes equipped with a printing press, and unfortunately, it uses it far too extensively. I always like that British saying, and I first read it attributed to the Sea Lord Fisher, but probably goes before him. But now that the money has run out, we shall have to begin to think.
Yes. And isn't there another one that you Americans have, which is don't just stand there, spend something?
Yeah, well, I said that. Yes, that's one that one time I popped off. One time too many, I guess, because that has been thrown back at me over time.
Well, I'm not throwing it back at you. I think it's a great line to of course essentially take the Mickey out of what the Democrats were doing. And I'd like to go back to 2011 when they literally, and I remember this happening because it got into the British papers, it got into loads of papers all around the world. They fled the state sooner than vote on things like school vouchers and the right to work and so on. I never really got my mind around how the Constitution of Indiana worked so that you weren't able to pass legislation despite them being in the minority and fleeing the state. So very quickly, sorry, can you just give us a rundown that my listeners I know will also want to hear this, a rundown on how the Indiana Constitution works so that fleeing the state was an option, essentially?
We didn't really face too many constitutional obstacles. The 8 years that we served divided. For 2 years, we had a friendly legislature. Then for 4 years, a divided legislature. And the last 2 years, we won a very large victory, which we did all we could to produce, and it happened in 2010. And so the last 2 years, we had very large majorities, and we ran the table on things we had not been able to do before. but it was a different time. We had our very profound differences with our Democratic friends, but even in the interior 4 years, so it was 2, 4, and 2. We made significant progress every year. You just had to find things that either the opposition favored in principle. They might not like the way you did it. A good example was health insurance for the uninsured. They were deeply committed to the idea of that, helping more people be covered. I said, fine, but we're going to give them essentially health savings accounts for poor people. We're going to do it in a different way than traditional Medicaid and so forth. And so we were able to effect a compromise that accomplished a goal we both wanted through a means you would consider conservative. The last 2 years, there was some unfinished business. I'd always wanted to have universal choice in education. That was anathema to a Democratic Party that in our state, as everywhere else, is almost owned and operated by the teachers' unions. And so that we were able to do. You mentioned right to work, another litmus test issue, but we had the votes finally to do it and did. We abolished the inheritance tax or the death tax and so forth. So, the political climate meant there were limits in some years to what we could do, but we never took that as an excuse for not making some forward progress.
What do you think about the Democrats nationally today? There's been a poll, we're talking about late March 2025. There's only 27% of people polled have a positive view, and only 7% had a very positive view of the Democratic Party. Where does it go? What does it do now?
I've certainly gotten a lot of things wrong about American politics over recent years, but one thing that was just glaringly obvious to me 10 years ago, and I was telling my Democratic friends this even before the 2016 election. I certainly told them in their shock and dismay at Trump's first win. Their central problem has been their superciliousness, their sense of arrogance and superiority, lecturing and condescending and so forth to the American people. There were other issues, I think, but more than anything, I think explains their current low state. I told people then, I've repeated it many times since, if you look down your nose at people long enough, one day they will punch you in it. And that's what happened. And then the Biden administration, which of course came in, promising to be Warren Harding, and then immediately, became Bernie Sanders, was the worst of this. And so they didn't learn from 16, and in fact, I'm afraid, renewed that sort of sense of cultural imperialism that I think far and away was their biggest. Yes, inflation. Yes, immigration. Although to an extent, those are offsprings of that attitude they had. Now, here and there, I'm reading Democrats, for the moment, they are renegades or they're outliers, but they've got the right answer. There are some congressmen saying more or less what I just did. We've got to quit looking down on people and telling them how to live their lives, and resume relating to ordinary people. Andrew, when I ran for political office, and it's not that long ago, the world was upside down compared to today. If you were a Republican, it was assumed that you were, from the country club and an economic elite, social elite, and so forth. And you had to go prove it. I spent 16 months traveling this state to all the forgotten places, all the no one comes here anymore places. I stayed overnight in people's homes, never hotels, all to demonstrate that
And
we
didn't
were
you go
about
in a
upward
van?
mobility.
Didn't you go in a camper van or something? I
Yes,
seem
it
to
was an
remember.
Indiana-built
Yeah, and you got people
entry-level
to,
RV. It's in the
and
State Museum. It became
I
an
was about to say
icon
because
because it had
people
been.
signed their names on it
That's
as well,
correct.
didn't they? Yeah, it's a great story. Great story.
And but it wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a, weekend listening tour. It was every day of 16 months. But the big reason, I mean, I learned a lot about it was enormously helpful in terms of
Mm,
trying to perform the job well. But a lot of it was about proving, as one did have to then, that it was ordinary people and upward mobility that motivated us.
mm.
These days, it's the world's gone into reverse, and Democrats are going to have to reestablish their own credibility in that way. These days, Republicans inherits it as they once did.
Yeah. Tell me, in 2013, when you left the governorship and became president of Purdue, one of the great universities of the United States, what were your experiences with the Department of Education? Tell us about because there's talk obviously of dismantling it. What are the pros and cons of doing that in your view?
Are you asking about the department now?
The Department of Education.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think we could do without it, honestly. Whether they'll be able to achieve that, once again, it takes like Doge, it takes legislation. I can't, you'll never get there simply by issuing executive orders. I don't think. I think courts will draw some line there. But no, I mean, it's um, everything that's being said about it's being a superfluous or worse, I tend to agree with. And if we're going to spend that kind of money to support the highly local function, to historically local function of education, then just send the money, not the regulations, not the bureaucrats that come with it, not the ideology that has undergirded much of the money they've been sending. When I was working for President Reagan, um, Bill Bennett, just a tremendous figure in recent American times, I'm sure you know him well, um, was the secretary. And I remember in one meeting, he said, "Mr. President, you came to office pledging to get rid of the Department of Education. And because of the Congress we have, we can't do that. So we're going to run the department in a way that makes the people who created it want to abolish it." And that's an option,
Yeah.
and that they, I think, have already somewhat embarked on.
Let's speak about foreign affairs if we may. The well, foreign affairs, but also actually the effects they have on America, including Purdue. Actually, we've seen how President Trump has cut the funding to Columbia because of the anti-Semitism that's been seen on the campus there. We've seen the Tentifada, as it's called, in universities in the United States and also at Oxford and Cambridge here in England.
Mhm.
Um, what's your sense about the sort of dividing line between um, complete freedom of speech, of course, on one side, and also the really unpleasant scenes that we've been seeing with Jewish students being intimidated by people in the Tentifada? What does one do as a former university professor?
Yeah,
Sorry, president.
yeah. There's an old American joke about the rancher who hits the donkey, across with a 2x4, and when asked why, he says, "Well, you want him to move first, you have to get the jackass's attention." And I I I suspect, but I could be wrong. I suspect, and I rather hope that that's what many of these things are about, whether it's American universities or some of our international friends or other countries, that that there's a sense that of trying to jolt people out of into action or into a different mode, and that they'll back off a little bit if they do. I mean, um, I think it's perfectly fine to discipline schools who did what they allowed, in some cases, or even encouraged it. At the same time, the overall research enterprise in this country needs to go forward, and universities need to be part of it. We need more research, particularly into things that will affect the national security of this country, and the hard sciences and so forth. So I hope that the donkey's attention has been gotten. We've seen in the international context some of these tariff moves, which then led to some behavior modification. I hope that's what we see ultimately, with all its faults. And I said this for the decade that I worked in higher education, for all its faults and all the legitimacy of most of the criticisms about affordability and absence of diversity of opinion, and all these things are true. With all that, we want the system to correct its errors and remain the premier such system in the world. And so I hope that that's what we'll see. And this may be a little bit crude or blunderbuss way to go about it, but the change needs to come, or something worse will happen. You've seen how public confidence, even the confidence of the young people in schools today, has unraveled, and that's not a good thing.
You mentioned tariffs. Is there a good economic rationale for America's current tariff policy?
No, I don't think so. Again, unless it's a tactic, and if it's an effective tactic, that then we're able to achieve some goals that are important. I mean, we needed to restore our borders, no question about it. If this helps speed that and cement it in place, that's a good thing. And we need to stop the flow of killer drugs into this country. If this can be used effectively, we haven't seen that yet, but if it can be, then I understand it. But once it goes past tactics, if it's meant to be a long-standing economic policy, here's one of the only topics I can think of in which economists of all kinds and stripes seem to agree they can't find value in it.
Because trade wars lead to inflation and other bad things.
And worse outcomes. Yes, they do.
Yeah. Tell me, with regard to Ukraine, the situation now seems to be completely up in the air. What would be a good outcome for the United States? And would that be the same thing as a good outcome for Europe, for Ukraine, for the rest of the world?
Maybe two questions here. What would be a good outcome? What's the best available outcome? Those things are not always synonymous.
No, very true. Sorry, do those. Yes, those are the key ones.
My friend Stephen Kotkin, he's up there in the Roberts category. Almost.
He's been on the show. No, we've had Stephen. We've had Stephen on the show.
Respect and admiration.
Thank you.
Has been very, I guess I'd say, pessimistic about the Ukrainian military situation for a good long time, not just recently, and leads me to believe that the best available outcome might be one in which most of Ukraine is preserved. A very positive thing I think we are seeing is suddenly Europe reawakened to the importance of national security. I hope they move quickly, to nudge up their investments in their own security. 3% is probably not enough, but maybe the speed at which they increase is the most important thing. So that may be the best. I don't affect to be an expert in this subject, but we know who Putin is. We know what his long-term aspirations are, and as once we contained the old Soviet Union, we're going to need an effective policy of containment his oligarchic situation is probably as prone to internal decay or even collapse as the old Soviet system is, as long as he doesn't overrun Europe before that happens.
And so long as pressure is kept up on him.
Yes.
Um, Lightening the mood a little, we've got a random member of the public. Sometimes random members of the public ask me questions to ask you, and we've got somebody called Paul Felton from Nevada who wants to know what are the particular virtues of a big Harley-Davidson over the more common BMWs and Japanese motorcycles one sees in the US?
Well, now we're on to something very important. I'll struggle to keep the answer brief. No, I mean, I'll give you, the first virtue clearly is noise. The BMW is, most of the Japanese motorcycles are entirely too quiet. And those of us who, and I should say, I never owned a BMW, but I owned a variety of Japanese motorcycles. They're all very well made, Hondas in particular. But no, those of us who rode the American Harley-Davidson always said it was a safety issue. You make enough noise that the motorists don't run you over.
Okay, well, I'll let Mr. Felton know. PJ O'Rourke was a friend of yours, one of the great humorists and
Yes.
obviously political humorists of the 20th century. And he sadly is no longer with us, but you wrote an article recently lamenting his passing, of course. How important would you say is the capacity to retain a sense of humor at the high level of politics that
Yeah.
you've worked in all your life?
I think it's enormously important in multiple ways. One is for those of us who um, are skeptical of government and it getting too big and too expensive and intrusive and so forth. We need people who can effectively poke fun. As I wrote there, puncturing of pretensions is a very noble endeavor, and PJ was as good as any that we've known in that respect. But even more broadly, I think there's such a sad and I hope temporary prevalence in our society, at least these days, to politicize everything and to put politics at the center of life. It doesn't belong there. And humor is a good way to remind people that there are other things far more important. I've worried about this, written about this, in other ways, but certainly thinking about the loss of PJ, I brought it to mind again. So yeah, I think we need to recover our sense of humor for many reasons, but to keep our politics in its proper place is certainly first among them.
History is important, isn't it? This is a history podcast, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But nonetheless, in terms of the culture wars that we're sort of
Yeah.
forced to fight, nobody wants to, but but they exist. You were great when it came to putting Howard Zinn in his place, the author of the essentially Marxist, what he called the People's History of the United States. Terrible book. Do you see still today, even years later, a history being an important sort of aspect in the struggle for the future of American culture?
Andrew, it's not important, it's central. And I didn't put him in his place. He's still out there. In the sense that his books are used in a depressingly and alarmingly large number of districts. I haven't looked lately, but this sort of anti-historical poison has been fed to a large percentage of today's young people, and you see it. You can't blame today's young people. I don't anyway, for some of the absurd and anti-American and anti-freedom postures that they take, because this is the history they've been taught or mistaught. No, I mean, I did speak up about its use in Now, it's always important to be clear. If some college professor wants to teach that rot, we protect that right. He's not the only professor on campus. There are other books, and the students are of an age where we hope they are able to think critically and discern, uh, fact from fiction and so forth. That's very different than teaching a third grader to despise his country, which
Yeah,
is what is happening in too many cases, or wherever
yeah.
Zen was being taught. So, yeah,
Well
I
done.
haven't dealt with this in quite a long time, but as far as I know, it is still a problem.
Yeah,
He's not the only, I think, bogus history that's out there, but he's probably the worst example.
yeah, yeah. But well done for being one of the few people to sort of stand up and tell the truth on that. Staying with history, what's the history book or the biography that you're reading at the moment?
Well, I've been trying to fill in one of the many gaps in my historical knowledge, and I don't know, I sort of wandered into antiquity a little bit, or semi-antiquity. So
Great, we love
I
that on this
recently
show.
read a book, a survey on the Ottoman Empire, from its origins to its um, demise in our century. Um,
Who by?
sorry?
Who by? Who was the author? Was it John Julius Norwich? Was it Stephen Runciman? There are a few
I'll tell you the
single
title,
volumes.
then I'd have to go pull it off the shelf. It was called Lords of the Horizon, I believe.
Okay, you don't need a title. That's sorry, you don't need an author.
Yeah.
We've got that.
Um,
That's good.
no,
Lords of the Horizon.
I read a couple about Alexander the Great. And I confess I just read one about the Templars. I was
Oh
very
yes.
disappointed to find out that the myths tend not to be uh, or tend to be mythical in many cases.
Which
All those
which
exciting
wh
ideas about grand conspiracies and secret societies. But
yeah.
and my most
I
recent one was more recent, but I really enjoyed it. There's a great book called Raid on the Sun, and it's about the Israeli attack on the Osirak nuclear facility in Iraq back in the 80s.
yeah.
Fascinating.
I I've just looked up Lords of the Horizons, the history of the Ottoman Empire, and it's been written by Jason Goodwin.
Yes,
So
thank
anybody
you.
who's
Yep.
interested in that. And last question, your favorite what if, your counterfactual history
Oh,
story.
well, I'm fond of those little quirky ones. Um, uh, for instance, the finding of the orders that led to the Battle of Antietam. The soldier who lost them was actually an Indiana corporal, I believe he was, who found them wrapped in a cigar wrapper or something. And so McClellan, who had otherwise been outgeneraled by Lee at every turn, knew what to do. And I'll get this slightly wrong, Andrew, but in Churchill's um, rendition, I guess it's in History of the English Speaking Peoples,
Yeah.
he had this great line that always stuck with me. It's something like, "On such tiny agate points do the wheels of history turn." And
Marvelous.
so I think of that every time you think of some little what if. I
Yeah.
like the one where King Alexander of Greece gets bitten by the monkey
Yes.
and triggers a war that might not have
It
happened
happened otherwise.
otherwise.
Yes.
But in terms of
Exactly.
big ones, I
Yeah.
suppose I'd pick uh, Barbarossa. If Hitler um, had controlled his mania about Russia and lands to the east, we wouldn't like. I suspect the outcome of the war would have been less fortunate. You
What if
could
he
you could
timed it
instruct me
better,
on
or
that, but I just
do you
thought,
mean if Hitler had timed it better and won in the east, or pushed
well,
the Russians back beyond the
if he'd
Urals, as it
started
were?
earlier and it didn't get bogged down in the
Yeah,
winter,
yeah,
or if he'd
yeah,
attacked England instead, I don't.
yeah.
Uh, but
No, absolutely. Well, we always yeah, we look at those what ifs And usually people look at what ifs in order to find a better world, but actually in that case, obviously you get a worse one
I think you
with
would.
Hitler in control. Being bitten by the monkey, monkeys bite people the entire time. It's his own stupid fault for having a pet monkey, don't you think?
Well, not always with such consequences. Yeah.
Mitch Daniels, 49th governor of Indiana. Thank you very much for coming on the show. When you mentioned Ronald Reagan and the difference between politicians who are gyroscopes and politicians who are just sort of sonar reactors, it's very clear from your entire career that you have been the soundest of gyroscopes, and it's a great honor to have had you on Secrets of
Well,
State.
you're too kind, Andrew, but I would just say in closing that reading history is this, I always thought was the single best way to try to develop a good sense of what to do. I've told so many young people, you get the leadership question all the time, and I tell them I didn't find a how-to book ever that I thought was particularly helpful, but I said, read biography. Read the life stories of people who either did it well or maybe didn't, and that's where the best lessons come from. And I think anything at least I internalized and tried to use, probably I got that way.
That is entirely the underlying philosophy of this podcast. So thank you very much, Mitch. We couldn't have ended better. Thank you again. Thank you, Mitch. On the next episode of Secrets of Statecraft, my guest will be Daniel Sammet, an expert on US-Israeli relations.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.